All right, guys, in this class, we'll discuss behavioral economics, explain how it contrasts with neoclassical economics. It will relate to prospect theory, help explain consumer behaviors, and how time inconsistency and myopia cause people to make suboptimal long-run decisions. It will also define fairness and give examples of how it affects behavior in the economy. The last word is how researchers in the UK found ways to nudge people towards making different choices. One example um, that has affected many Americans in recent years was related to how they implement retirement plans. And there was a point where when you start a new job that was full time, if they had a retirement plan, it didn't default you into it. You had to opt into it. So therefore, less people applied or got into their 401k plan. They made a change in the regulation that instead of opting in, you have to opt out. There's also been studies with this in regards to organ donors. If they make it default in the state that you opt in to organ donation, um, and then they have a plan where instead you have to opt out. More people donate organs when the choice is to opt out rather than opt in. So you can make small changes in behavior, in the way things are worded, in the way questions are asked, in order to change outcomes. This also helps explain some of the irrationality in the market. Why don't we all make the perfect decisions? So we'll talk about systematic errors in the origin of behavioral economics. Uh, our efficient, error-prone brains is discussed, prospect theory, myopia and time inconsistency, and then fairness and self-interest. How selfish behavior kind of can impact all this stuff. Neoclassical economics have always believed that people act rationally when making decisions, but evidence shows that's not always the case. We find that people make systematic errors, which means they make the same errors over and over again. Neoclassical answered back that consumers were ignorant about the situation and just need to be educated on the matter. But they found that people persisted in making errors even when it was pointed out to them that they were acting against their own best interest. Behavioral economics was developed in order to help frame a more accurate predictive outcome for human beings. So, you know, it's really behavioral economics is just looking to explain irrational behavior. So, if you saw this in an algebra equation, it would be like a variable at the end. People have stable preferences that aren't affected by context. People are eager and accurate calculating machines. This is what neoclassical economics believes. People are good planners who possess plenty of willpower. People are almost entirely selfish and self-interested. Now, all these things are playing out like one of these academic cases where what if all these scenarios holds true in real life, and it doesn't. So, we're not perfectly rational. We're not calculating machines. When you go to look at an apartment for the first time and you're calculating the additional gas from the distance of your work versus the cost of the new apartment, no one's doing that, right? You're just like settling on what you think is, well, there's a term for it, might come up in this chapter. It's called satisfice. You just choose the best among a small variety of options that you have in front of you. Um, Behavioral economics focuses on the mental process behind these decisions, improving outcomes by improving decision making. Many economists prefer to think of neoclassical and behavioral economics as complementary approaches that can be used in conjunction to help our understanding of human behavior. Incentives matter. Neoclassical economics believe that consumers care a great deal about prices, so they cannot explain impulsive buying very well. However, behavioral economics explains impulse buying and other irrational behaviors as a result of a wide variety of underlying factors. So this is something also to consider when looking at the two. It's almost like neoclassical is the baseline of economics, and then behavioral is meant to explain more of the complex stuff that is not as easily, explained. So this is a good chart for a next exam. Major differences between behavioral and economics. I would say this is like a perfect quiz slide. It has the differences side by side. So please make note of this one. Heuristics are energy savers. They're rules of thumb. So mental shortcuts. Um, you know, I'm trying to think of a good one in this example, but there's some here. Catching a baseball with a gaze heuristic. These are terrible examples actually. Riding a bicycle with steering heuristics, guesstimating the rank with recognition heuristics, implications of hardwired heuristics. So it's something that you see when you see X, it means Y, right? They are shortcuts. So in the stock market world, there's something called a head and shoulders pattern, and it's usually considered negative. That's it. So when I see this pattern, I don't need to know anything else. The position of the stock appears to be bearish. Now, it's a mental shortcut. Does it work every time? No. But it's something that you see and you associate with something else. There are plenty of other examples of that. Like you see someone who's really tall, you'd be like, oh, they might be good at basketball, right? It's a heuristic. Things like that, simple rules of thumb. The brain is modular, which means specific areas of our brain deal with specific sensations like vision, breathing, and anger differently. The brain's decision making has two parts, system one and system two. System one uses a lot of heuristics, the older part of the brain, and system two uses newer parts of the brain to undertake slow, deliberate, conscious calculations. Um, the unconscious mental process suffer from a variety of cognitive biases, which are misrepresentations that cause systematic errors. So that example I just gave you a second ago, where you had the head and shoulders chart supposed to be a negative heuristic. Well, what if it's not? What if the stock goes on to make all new all-time highs, very quickly? That would be a systematic error of that heuristic. There's other biases. Confirmation bias. Bias refers to the human tendency to only pay attention to information that agrees with us. And I'm sure we can think about people in our lives. That's a very common bias that you might see in the world, right? Like, only show me information that I agree with, and I'm going to ignore everything else. Self-serving bias is another one. You're going to do what's in your best interest, and you're always going to tilt towards that. Overconfidence bias, right? Anyone who's ever played against an athlete who thought they were better than they were. But the problem with the overconfidence bias is that they usually don't see it, right? That's why it's a bias, because they themselves are blind to it. Hindsight bias. This would be akin to someone saying, "Oh yeah, the pandemic. I predicted that right at the start of this thing." Like, did I? Who knows, right? But I'm making this claim that's oh, I knew that. Of course I did. Um, Availability heuristic. This is similar to, in some ways, confirmation bias, but it's more related to your access to information. So, like, if you only have, conservative right wing news all around you, that's really going to be your only option for stuff to listen to. And you might have a bias because that's just like what's in your atmosphere. Planning fallacy is a tendency for people to have massively underestimate the time needed to complete a task. Oh yeah, I'll have it done in a week, but it really takes them a lot longer than that. Framing effect occurs when a change in context causes people to react differently to a particular piece of information. You'd see like, lawyers do this maybe in a criminal show where they'll like ask a question that's like not um, it's meant to steer the witness. Like, when was the last time you beat up your significant other, right? You're not asking whether they did or not. You're asking when the last time was. So that question, the way it's designed, could help effectively create a bias. How people cope with negative possibilities is a central focus to behavioral economics. Many observations have been cataloged as to how people actually deal with the prospect of bad things as well as good things. Three very interesting facts summarize how people deal with good and bad. So people tend to judge good things and bad things in relative terms. as gains and losses to their status quo. People experience both diminishing marginal utility for gains as well as diminishing marginal disutility for losses. So, when you make your first $10 million, you know, the next million isn't going to feel as good compared to like when you just went from 0 to 1 million. So you'll find like diminishing marginal returns for money. And then if you make 100 million and then you make another 10, it's not going to feel as good as, that early wealth you created. Um, People experience loss aversion. This is also very common. People experience the pain of losses to a greater degree than the benefit of gains, the mental benefit of gains, or the pleasure of gains. Prospect theory helps us understand how consumers plan for and deal with life's ups and downs. Businesses have to be very careful about increasing the price they charge for products, because once consumers become used to a given price, they will view any increase as a loss relative to their status quo. Framing effects have a major consequence for consumer behavior, because any frame that alters whether consumers consider a situation to be a gain or loss will affect their consumption as well. So there are studies that suggest if you think your house doubled in value, you'll spend more money because you believe you own this asset that is worth more, right? So even if you have the same amount in your bank account, if your house is worth more, you'll spend more. Now that's, technically another bias, because you can't spend your house, right? It's not a liquid account. Uh, by showing such small minimum payment amounts, credit card companies anchor many customers into expensive habit of paying off their debt. They're showing you that minimum monthly payment you can make. It looks attractive, right? Only $20 a month, but they don't say you might be paying it off for 10 years. The endowment effect is a tendency that people have to put higher valuation on anything they own. So that's another very common one, right? If you own it, it's worth more. I find this like especially true in like some of the cryptocurrency crowds. But, you can also say this with like any collectible too, right? Like people just have an endowment bias there. Status quo bias is the tendency that people have to favor an opinion that is expressed to them as being the default opinion. This table shows a selection of European countries, the percentage of their relative respective populations that have indicated their willingness to participate in an organ donor program. I actually started talking about this at the beginning of the chapter, where I was mentioning these like opt-in or opt-out programs. If you want people to do something, you're better off having that option be the default and allowing them to opt out than having the decision to opt in. If that's your goal, is to have people like participate in whatever this program is, whether it's health insurance or organ donors or something else. If you make it so they have to opt out, you'll just have way more eyeballs on your business, whatever that business is. Myopia and time inconsistency. Economists use myopia to describe the fact that brains have a hard time conceptualizing the future. The primary consequence of myopia is that people are faced to choose between something that will generate benefits quickly and something that won't yield benefits for a long time. They will have a very strong tendency to favor more immediate options. So, it's our like lizard brains kicking in. Like, we don't care about long-term benefits. All we care about is short-term gains or short-term pleasure. So there's a huge tendency to make wrong decisions because of that bias. Um, Time inconsistency is to cause people to systematically misjudge at the present time what you will want to do in some future. Is if your future self ends up disagreeing with your present self. This is a major cause of self-control problems. The key to fighting time inconsistency, the key to fighting time inconsistency and self-control problems is to have a good understanding of what your future self is likely to want. You can make pre-commitments and take actions ahead of time your future self to prevent your future self from doing too much damage. Um, so other things that can be done here: automatic payroll deductions, salary smoothing. I think we might talk about this in class. If you have a job with a high bonus structure, what's better, high bonus or high base salary? Usually you have a chance to make more with a high bonus. My personal advice to you guys is I would only take a bonus structure if it was based on, metrics that are trackable. Because sometimes you'll find yourself in these bonus structures where they're just based on like a whim. There's no formula to it. It's just like whatever they feel like. And in those cases, I would opt for, a higher base salary and not take the chance. Neoclassical models assume that people are purely self-interested. What behavioral economists have discovered is that the human propensity to care about others extended to every type of economic behavior. So while self-interest and selfishness exists, it's not a primary characteristic. Most people care deeply about others and how they are interacting with others. As a result, economic transactions are heavily influenced by moral and ethical factors. Fairness is a person's opinion as to whether a price, wage, or allocation is considered morally or ethically acceptable. Many everyday economic behaviors indicate that people care substantially about fairness. So this is just a kind of takeaway from that economic view in the neoclassical world, where purely driven by selfish behavior. But when you factor in real life behavioral economics, that's not always going to be the case. This can play into your everyday life when looking at like fair trade practices. Like, are you buying clothes from, um, somewhere that's like unethical or slave labor, or are you paying the farmers a fair wage, or will you pay up to use some more like sustainable brand? Our understanding of fairness and how it affects economic transactions has been reinforced and refined in recent decades by examining experimental games that were specifically designed to test people's feelings about fairness. Outcomes suggest that people care about fairness and are not purely self interested. It has been found that people share with others even when anonymity would allow them to be perfectly selfish, and that people will reject deals that they consider unfair to themselves. Now that behavioral economics has made significant headway in explaining many behaviors, some economists are suggesting that insights be used to nudge people towards making better decisions. This goes back to what I was saying too about opt-in versus opt-out programs. Um, UK found that people substantially increased tax payments by mailing letters that said neighbors had already paid, reminding people that they should make their tax payment. Sending text messages to students on Sunday night that they look forward to seeing them next week by school administration increased class attendance. That little nudge. It talked about increased savings by 82% for a group in a commitment savings account where they just like committed towards making like one of these Acorn type accounts where you like put your spare change in, right? They saved more by using that rather than not being in that program. Anyway, that's the end of this chapter. We'll do one more. Thanks.